started. Can you hear me okay? Okay. My name is DEEPA IYER, and I'm the Executive Director of South Asian Americans Leading Together, and I'm really excited to welcome all of you on what looks like a really rainy and gross day outside in Washington. Thanks for taking cover here at the National Education Association, and thanks to all the folks at the NEA who gave us the space and made this event possible as well. We're really excited to have all of you join us here in person, and also the folks who are joining us from the media on webinar. And what I want to do is just take care of a few housekeeping items before we launch into the actual presentation and hear from our guest speakers as well. So first of all, for those of you who are joining us via webinar, if you should have any technical questions, please email us at info@SAALT.org or call us at 571-239-3547. And during the presentation, those on the webinar will be able to ask questions, so please do so by just inserting your questions into the webinar interface, or you can email us at info@SAALT.org. I want to give folks a preview of what to expect this afternoon. First of all, we're going to present some of the key findings from our new report that we're releasing today called From Macacas to Turban Toppers, The Rise of Xenophobic and Racist Rhetoric in Political Discourse. And PRIYA, our policy director and primary author of the report, is going to present those. And then we'll hear from two guest speakers and their perspectives on xenophobic and racist rhetoric. We'll first hear from HILARY Shelton, who is the director of the NAACP Washington, D.C. Bureau, a good friend that I've had the pleasure of knowing for a number of years. Thank you for being here, HILARY. And ARSALAN IFTIKHAR, who's a frequent commentator on NPR and CNN and a prominent blogger. ARSALAN, we know how busy you are as well, so thank you for taking the time to be here. So before I give you some overarching themes about our report, I want to talk a little bit about SAALT and give you some background on the organization. We're a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and our mission is to elevate the perspectives of South Asian community-based organizations and individuals to address issues that affect South Asians in their daily lives, issues such as the ones that we're going to talk about today. We have 4 primary program areas, and they include community mobilization and outreach, policy advocacy, leadership development, and partnerships. And I hope that for those of you who are new to SAALT, that you'll take the time to meet one of our tremendous, wonderful staff members who are here today, or go on our website, SAALT.org, and get involved and become donors, supporters, members, partners. We would appreciate your involvement. So what we're doing today with the release of our report is to really document what we see as the rise of xenophobia and racism in American political discourse. And these statements are occurring primarily from elected officials and people running for office from both sides of the aisle. And while it's true that such rhetoric has been part of our country's political life for decades, since September 11th especially, we've documented an unprecedented increase of these sorts of remarks with a disproportionate impact on South Asians, Sikhs, Muslims, and Arab Americans. And I think a lot of us here know that there are 2 phenomena that are occurring simultaneously in our country. On one hand, we have a rise in civic and political engagement of minorities and communities of color, new immigrants, but at the same time, we're also facing a country where it seems absolutely okay to label new immigrants and communities of color in racist and xenophobic ways. So what this report is intended to do, and what this briefing is intended to do actually, is to send both an alarm bell and also send a call to action and accountability. What we're hoping, beyond highlighting some of the impact of the report of xenophobic rhetoric, is to make sure that all of us are playing a role in stemming the tide of xenophobia and racism, because if we don't, it could have a significant impact on political participation in our community, and it could also lead to the implementation of negative policies. We found that xenophobic and racist rhetoric casts our community members in 4 overarching categories, and those are listed here on the slide. First, we're seen as threats to national security, and this has been especially the case after September 11th. Secondly, we're seen as political liabilities. So even though on one hand, candidates are courting our community for votes and donations, we're also seen as liabilities, a community to be distanced from. Thirdly, we're seen as outsiders and foreigners. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the use of the derogatory term macaca, which is also part of the title of our report. Examples such as that, or even the more recent controversy over Park 51, shows that people in our community are often viewed as outsiders and foreigners. And finally, that we're not suitable political candidates. In fact, even given an overwhelming number of candidates running for public office from our communities, this year, for example, we've counted 6 candidates running for Congress and 1 for governor of South Asian descent. We're still seen as not politically suitable. And some of you may have heard the NPR story that ran this morning on Morning Edition that talks a little bit about while South Asians are gaining political clout, they still have to overcome a number of hurdles. Such rhetoric that we're talking about and that you'll hear more about can't be classified as just ignorant or funny or inconsequential because it can have far-reaching impact, such as leading to a sense of isolation and alienation on the part of community members, stemming our interest in civic and political engagement, shaping negative views about our community on the part of the general public, and most important, sanctioning a climate where private discrimination, harassment, and violence, as well as harmful policies, can occur. But all of us can take a role in addressing the climate of xenophobia in our country. And we hope to use the opportunity today, less than a week before the midterm elections, to not only better understand the climate we're living in, but to also identify strategies that will help to enrich our country's civic and political life. So with that overview, I'm going to turn it over to PRIYA MURTHY, SAALT's policy director, who's also the primary author of the report, to talk to us in greater detail about some of the findings in it.
Great, thank you, DEEPA. As DEEPA mentioned, this report is intended to be both a documentation resource as well as a tool for the community who is affected by such rhetoric to be empowered and to raise awareness and hold those who are making these statements accountable. And in that vein, based upon the types of remarks that emerged as we were collecting the incidents over the past 10 years, the report is divided up into 3 different sections. The first are comments that are made against the Arab, Muslim, Sikh, or South Asian communities as a whole. The second section of the report focuses on comments that are lodged against South Asian candidates or candidates of South Asian descent. And the third section of the report is a toolkit that can be used by community members in order to take action and hold those who are making these statements accountable. I wanted to pause for a moment and talk a little bit about the methodology that we used as we were pulling together this report. And as we were collating the remarks and the incidents that have emerged, particularly since 9/11, we were especially interested in seeing whether and how the rhetoric that's been used in political discourse both mirrored and perpetuated and contributed to the broader backlash that occurred against our communities. I did want to add a caveat, which is that this report is not meant to be exhaustive. It's rather used, it rather would be useful to see it as illuminating the range of comments that are being made against our communities, what types of stereotypes are being perpetuated about community members, and what's the impact of these misperceptions that are created about those who come from South Asian countries. As we were culling the comments that formed the basis of our report, we relied upon various resources, primarily press articles, including mainstream media outlets and ethnic papers, also blogs, as well as television advertisements that ran. But we also relied upon action alerts from ally organizations within the Arab, Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian communities in order to determine what the scope of the situation really was. First and foremost, we wanted to have a clear baseline understanding of what is considered xenophobic or racist, and which basically determined whether a particular comment had the dubious distinction of being included in our report. And while there's no scientific definition, obviously, of what racist is or what xenophobic is, we thought it would be valuable to use a few metrics so we could determine what could be included in this larger project that we were engaging in. And we primarily looked at whether statements relied upon or perpetuated stereotypes that have historically and contemporarily been used against our communities as well as other communities of color. For example, casting community members as terrorists or quote-unquote the enemy or as quote-unquote invaders, using racial epithets, or blaming our particular community members as the reason for the loss of jobs or the poor economic state that the country is in. And all of these comments effectively demarcate us as different or outside from who the image of quote-unquote real Americans are. Before I actually delve into the substance and the nitty-gritty of the report, we just wanted to give a quick snapshot of what we discovered as we were collecting this information. As you can see, the report includes a total of around 75 remarks that have been made, and all but 10 of these remarks were made during election years. 23 of these remarks were made during the time when the country was talking about Part 51, so really within the span of a couple of months. 11 candidates of South Asian descent were targeted by such types of rhetoric, and 32 remarks were related to profiling or casting our communities as connected to terrorism in the post-9/11 climate. 8 remarks purported that sent the notion that the United States is not a Christian nation, and it rejected the idea that we are religiously a pluralistic nation. 6 comments cast us as political liabilities, as DEEPA had mentioned earlier, and 7 more broadly painted us as foreigners or outsiders within a country that we called home. So now we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the 4 different themes that DEEPA had outlined. And the first theme that emerged is that our community is being painted as threats to national security. So even though we're 10 years after 9/11, the image that's still being broadcast of who is a terrorist is by and large someone who is Muslim or someone who is perceived to be Muslim. An example of this is portraying our communities as inherently violent. And as you can see on the screen here, there was a comment that was made by former Senator Conrad Burns of Montana. And what he said is that the United States is up against a, quote, faceless enemy of terrorists who, quote, drive taxi cabs in the daytime and kill at night. And what the impact of this comment was is that it basically says that this community is an enemy community. And the effect that it has on those who belong to this community is that they are effectively dehumanized within the eye of the general public. Beyond the impact of molding public perceptions, lawmakers, as part of their duty as public servants, also shape policies affecting all Americans. And since 9/11, profiling, discrimination, and surveillance of community members in a variety of contexts has occurred. And perhaps the most visible example of post-9/11 profiling has been the disparate treatment of Sikh and Muslim passengers through airport security based on their attire. But a less visible form of discrimination also occurs when our places of worship are being monitored or FBI is appearing at the homes of community members. A few examples of policymakers really endorsing these types of laws that affect our community include the comments that are made by Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma earlier this year. He said, "I believe in racial and ethnic profiling. I think if you're looking at people getting on an airplane and you have X amount of resources to get into it, you need to get at the targets, not my wife. All terrorists are Muslims or Middle Easterners between the age of 20 and 35. That's by and large true." Another example, unfortunately, we have too many mosques in this country and we should be looking at them more carefully. We should be finding out how we can infiltrate them, and that was made by Congressman Peter King of New York in 2007. So the cumulative effect of these statements is that they portray these communities as being, quote, at war with America, which has an impact both on the public and the private sphere. Rather than being seen as friends, neighbors, and colleagues, our community is seen as threats, violent, or dangerous. And when it enters the policy realm, as the last 2 statements demonstrated, endorsing state-sponsored discrimination and the promotion of an environment within the halls of legislatures and among the general public is basically the message that's being sent. It's okay to treat our communities differently, to segregate us, to monitor us. So when policy prescriptions actually come up, such as the End Racial Profiling Act, community members and advocates really face resistance from both lawmakers and from the general public in terms of garnering support for these types of policies because there's this broader misperception that exists about the South Asian community. A second theme that emerged was rhetoric casting community members as outsiders and foreigners. And a microcosm of the broader issues that are at play emerged during the national referendum that occurred around the Park 51 Cultural Center construction project in New York City. And while Park 51 seemed to be about building a Muslim cultural center, we saw that the impact of it spread beyond New York and it actually went into other parts of the country as well. And just a few quick examples. There was a campaign ad that was run by a congressional candidate in North Carolina, Renee Elmers, where the advertisement said, after the Muslims conquered Jerusalem and Cordoba and Constantinople, they built victory mosques. And now they want to build a mosque by ground zero. That ran earlier this year. There was another comment that was made by Ron Ramsey, who's a lieutenant governor of Tennessee and a gubernatorial candidate this year, and he said, you could even argue whether being a Muslim is actually a religion or is it a nationality, a way of life or cult or whatever you want to call it. And that's what he was saying in response to someone asking him about a mosque that was going to be built in Tennessee. So what the effect of these types of statements are is they basically reject the idea that the United States is a diverse country when it comes to religions. And it even goes a step further. It minimizes the First Amendment rights that Muslims are guaranteed by the Constitution to be able to practice. And this is simply based upon the faith that they practice and the fact that there's this image that if you belong to this faith that there is a perception that you're connected to terrorism somehow. And the impact is very real. It's not just mere words. It has a very tangible effect on the lives of community members. Hate crimes occurred in the wake of the Park 51 controversy. For example, Ahmed Sharif, a Bangladeshi cab driver, was slashed in the throat after a passenger had asked him if he was Muslim. And in Seattle, there was a Sikh convenience store clerk who was punched in the head after a customer asked him if he was part of Al-Qaeda. There's also vandalism of mosques in New York, Tennessee, California, Connecticut, Illinois, the list goes on, and opposition to mosque construction across the country, as well as the planned Quran burning that I'm sure many of you heard about in Florida. This outsider status and rejection of those of other faiths has not only affected the Muslim community, but it's also affected other faith communities as well. And one example is a statement that was made by former Congressman Bill Solly of Idaho in 2007 on the heels of the first Hindu prayer and first Muslim congressman being sworn into office. He said, "We not only have a Hindu prayer being offered in the Senate, we have a Muslim member of the House of Representatives now, Keith Ellison of Minnesota. Those are changes, and they are not what was envisioned by our founding fathers." And the impact of this message is that it's implied that those who follow certain religions are not welcome in this country, and they're not American. And an added layer to this impact is that community members feel a deep sense of alienation within a country that they have belonged to for a very long time. The perpetual foreigner refrain is also commonly used to engage in economic scapegoating, particularly around the issue of outsourcing. And an example that really demonstrates this is an ad that was run by Illinois State Representative Bob Fleiter in 2006 against his opponent Dick Kane, where he used individuals from India and China who were speaking through an interpreter who basically said, the big businesses that give Kane thousands of dollars employ many of us here in India. If Dick Kane is elected, that will continue. And the effect of this is that it basically gives a face to the troubled economy, and that face is a foreign face. And it can make community members the subject of targeted attacks for quote-unquote stealing U.S. jobs. And we've seen this come up in other communities as well. For example, I'm sure folks have heard about a slew of ads that have been running recently that paint Latino immigrants as the reason for the economic woes in this country and as undocumented immigrants that are seeking to take over this country. So this is by no means exclusive to the South Asian community, but does play out in a particular way as it relates to those from our communities. So what we've seen is that within this broader backdrop that has been set in place, the allegiance of community members are being placed into question. And the collateral effect is that even those policymakers and political candidates who may not go so far as to call our community terrorists or violent, they mistakenly still believe that they cannot even remotely be affiliated with these communities. And one famous example involves the rally that Barack Obama had in place last year when he was running for president. And there was a group of individuals who were invited to sit in the quote-unquote special section behind Barack Obama. And when a volunteer inviting them saw that two of the women were Muslim and wore hijabs, they made the following statement: because of the political climate and what's going on in the world and what's going on with Muslim Americans, it's not good for Arif, one of the women, to be seen on TV or associated with Obama. And while Obama apologized for the actions of the campaign volunteer, the damage had already been done within the community. And as DEEPA had mentioned earlier, our community has been courted by both parties, and a significant number of South Asians are joining voter rolls. In fact, during 2008, entities had been established to do targeted outreach to our communities, such as South Asians for McCain and South Asians for Obama. So it appears that the candidates wanted to have it both ways. They said, we want your vote, we want your money, but we don't want you near us. The final theme that emerged were comments portraying South Asians as unsuitable candidates because of their background. Comments made against candidates do not occur in a vacuum, and I think the previous examples show what the broader backdrop was behind the comments that are lodged against South Asian candidates. And they're emblematic of what opponents think will resonate within this broader xenophobic and Islamophobic climate. And though there's been an unprecedented number of South Asians who are running for office, what we've seen is that the more visible the community is, for some reason the more visible targets we have also become for such type of rhetoric. A couple of examples that have emerged. One involves Nikki Haley, who is running for governor in South Carolina. And South Carolina State Senator Jake Knott said, "We got a raghead in Washington. We don't need one in South Carolina. She's a raghead that's ashamed of her religion, trying to hide it behind being a Methodist for political reasons." And by way of context, the term raghead is a derogatory term that is particularly used against those who practice the Sikh religion. Another example involved Raj Goyal. Raj Goyal is running for office in Kansas for Congress. And his opponent linked to a blog post via Twitter that said, "This Goyal character is just another, quote, turban topper we don't need in Congress or any political office that deals with the U.S. Constitution, Christianity, and the United States of America." And there are several other incidents that have occurred recently as well. There have been examples that are included in the report where individuals who were running for office were made fun of, for lack of a better word, because they had accents or because they had last names that didn't sound like the quote-unquote mainstream American last name, an example being Surya Yalamanchili. There was evidence to show that his opponent was really harping on the fact that he had this quote-unquote foreign last name. And what the impact of these types of comments are against those who are running for office and come from South Asian backgrounds is that it diverts the focus of the issues within these campaigns. Basically, South Asian candidates have to run a different type of campaign within these races than those who may come from other backgrounds or those who are not from minority communities. Another aspect of this is that their legitimacy is questioned based upon race and religious factors, and they need to go that extra mile in order to prove their loyalty and to prove their capability in order to represent their own constituents. So what we've seen here, and has been mentioned earlier, is that there are various different effects and impacts that result from these types of comments. And just to summarize some of the more in-depth recommendations that are included in the report, one is that they can foster an environment where discriminatory policies can really flourish. And that has a serious impact on all minority communities and all Americans, quite frankly. The second impact is that it can gin up hysteria against community members who come from Arab, Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian backgrounds, as well as from other minority backgrounds. And the third, as mentioned before, it can lead to the questioning of the loyalty, identity, and patriotism of community members as well. So with this information, we wanted to present a call to action, both to policymakers and political candidates, as well as community members. When it comes to policymakers and political candidates, we urge them to condemn such statements when they do occur, and for political parties to implement a no-tolerance policy when it comes to xenophobic rhetoric within political discourse. We also urge them to build relationships with our community so they better understand where we're coming from and what our issues are. And also to oppose discriminatory policies and support policies that actually aim to end discrimination, including some of the ones that were mentioned earlier. And when it comes to the community, we believe there's a role that can be played by individuals who are of South Asian, Muslim, Sikh, and Arab descent as well. The first is to become aware of how your local legislators view your community. It's important to know who they are and what they think of those of us who come from these backgrounds. The second is to raise awareness about these incidents. We can't just let them slide. So we have to make sure that the media knows, as well as the legislators themselves, which goes to the third recommendation, which is to ask for accountability. And we should be really inclusive when we're asking for accountability, because these issues are not only ones that affect our community, but other communities of color. So we should step up when statements are made against other minority communities as well.
Thank you so much, Priya, for laying that out. You know, that's a lot of information, but we hope that folks found it useful. And what we want to do now is really turn to our guest speakers here and ask for your perspectives and your input. And I'm going to start first with Hilary Shelton. And before I kind of tell you your question, I wanted to ask all of you here, if you have questions, to start thinking of them, because we're going to open it up fairly quickly to you. And also for those who are participating by webinar, if you do have questions for us, you can email them to us at info@SAALT.org, or you can type them into our webinar interface on your screen. So Hilary, as I mentioned, is the director of the Washington, D.C. Bureau of the NAACP. And clearly, as Priya kind of mentioned when she closed, Hilary, we know that this sort of phenomenon is not new when it comes to the African American community. So we were wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the racist rhetoric has looked like for African Americans. How have African Americans stayed civically engaged, even in the face of such rhetoric, and what can we learn from that process and those experiences?
Well, thank you so much. Let me first thank you, DEEPA and PRIYA, for this fantastic report. The details in this report are extremely helpful, not only to the South Asian community, but the rest of the country as well. As I listened to your presentation and the report, something that was very clear to me is that what I was saying in many ways was a mirror image of the experiences African Americans and so many others have had in this country because of the very hyperbolic rhetoric that is too often used in our society. Indeed, we've seen incidents throughout the country, and you mentioned a couple of them along these lines of how those who are not even members of the same group are oftentimes targeted, because I'd always said that bigots are not the brightest people. We remember what happened during September 11th and shortly thereafter, that those who were Sikh were attacked because they assumed they were Muslim. Though it was wrong to attack anyone because they're Muslim because of something someone else did. Nonetheless, not only was it wrong, but it was wrong and it was stupid. As we talk about, I hate to use those simple terms, but it really boils down to a simple reflection. As we talk about the African American community, what we're seeing is the kind of rhetoric that actually ends up dehumanizing. If you dehumanize not only in the rhetoric that's utilized here in the United States, of those groups that are different than you, we see an interesting similarity to the kind of rhetoric that's utilized when we prepare to go to war, making it justifiable. If you first dehumanize, that you can very well kill, you can very well take away someone's freedom, you can very well take away their basic human rights if you determine they are somehow less than human beings. So when you have those that are saying things like actually denouncing one's faith or religion, saying that because you happen to have a particular faith or religion, that you are again somehow a terrorist, somehow an evil person, somehow again less than human. And we've seen it happen in the African American community as well. We come to a long line of experiences where the assumption was African Americans weren't fully human either. As we look at issues like slavery and being able to justify again the locking up and the forcing to work of people, what we find is that first you have to actually assume or be able to justify that they are not fully human, and therefore you should have some kind of jurisdiction over them. The kind of language that's being utilized here is very similar. Again, saying that your religion is, I've heard the term gutter religion being utilized to describe people within the Muslim communities, and other things being said along those lines. And again, if we think about it in real terms, I've also thought about how we don't have this kind of attack when the people were involved in the incident that leads to the broader justification for dehumanization are not people of color. An example, I do not remember, as we looked at what happened during the bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma, I do not remember them going after white 20-something-year-old male Christians. Though we do realize that we look at even the constitutions of such hate groups, we talk about the extremist side of these things, that utilize the same type of rhetoric. If we look at these groups, we'll see us in the constitution even of the Klan, It is required that you are a devout Christian. That's the language utilized in the Constitution. They don't want you to join if you're not a Christian person, as their Constitution reads. The challenge, of course, for those of us who happen to practice that particular religion, we realize that we don't believe in those things, and very well is able to be dismissed. But it's the same kind of rhetoric that's utilized. The same kind of dehumanizing rhetoric was utilized before we went into Germany. The same kind of dehumanizing rhetoric was utilized before we went into Japan. The same kind of rhetoric was utilized before we went into Vietnam. The same kind of dehumanizing rhetoric is always utilized to be able to justify violent activities, and again, the dehumanization that has a long list of challenges before you get to issues like being able to take someone's life because you see it as being somehow worth less than someone else's. It also means that you can take away someone's rights, someone's privileges, someone's opportunities. You can actually say someone can't live in a particular neighborhood because you know how those kind of people are. And it's gotten to the point where it gets utilized so often. Again, we've seen this in the African American community time and time again, where it got to the point where actually written into community codicils, you could not sell your house to someone that was not just like the white person that lived in the house in the first place. So indeed, we have also things that you cannot go to certain schools if you have to be a certain religion. Again, it's not just because they said that we don't like the differences in someone's color. It's because a whole set of attributes were attached to that person because of their membership within a particular group. And in the African American community, we've all heard the same kind of stereotypes that go on. African Americans are more violent. African Americans are more prone to be less trustworthy. African Americans are not going to be as smart. You utilize those kind of stereotypes, you attach to a particular person, and then particularly in a democratic society, the small d, a democratic society, when decisions are made about whether someone should be given the same resources as someone else, if you've already said they're not going to be able to fully utilize the resources because they're more violent and they're less prone to support the values of America in this particular case, they're somehow less human, you run into the same kind of problem. So what I'm saying is that the same trend now, and I would point to September 11th, being extended to the South Asian community that we've seen utilized in other communities. It was utilized against Native Americans. It was utilized against African Americans, very much as part of the tradition. Don't forget, among Native Americans, it was decided that because Native Americans had a different religion and appeared differently, that they couldn't even take care of their own children. And Native American children were taken away from their tribes, taken away from their tribal governments, and actually placed in other places because they viewed them as being, again, less than full human beings. It's so important that we look at the kind of rhetoric that's being utilized because some of it is becoming so subtle at this point that the assumptions are now written into the program. So we have newscasters talking in these terms as well. When you have Bill O'Reilly going on The View and speaking as if everybody knows that those who are Muslims are prone to violence and are all terrorists in the first place, we know we have a problem because that becomes the norm. And as terms are being utilized in their most vague manner, it means something very specific to how people are going to be treated as human beings and full citizens in our society.
Thank you so much, Hillary, for giving us that historical frame. And I think I saw a lot of heads nodding as you were talking and people understanding how we've seen this before and we continue to see it now. And we'll talk a little bit later, and hopefully this will also generate some comments from the audience about how we can all step up and stem this tide. But before we get there, I wanted to also ask ARSALAN IFTIKHAR to join our conversation. And as I mentioned earlier, ARSALAN is a prominent blogger and commentator on NPR and CNN as well. And ARSALAN, the question that we have for you is to talk a little bit about what you think this sort of rhetoric does in shaping the views of the general public about Muslims. And I know that you've been writing about this quite often over the summer, so if you could kind of talk a little bit and share with us your perspectives in that vein, that would be great.
Sure.
And I'm going to move the microphone this over to you. There you go.
Well, first of all, again, I want to thank SAALT, for coming up with this very, very timely report. You know, Newsweek magazine came out with a poll recently which showed that 24% of Americans believe that President Barack Obama is a Muslim. That's really their way of saying that President Barack Obama is black. And so the concept of Muslim today has become sort of the accepted slur in America. You know, whenever somebody says, you know, I believe that President Barack Obama is Muslim, I feel like Jerry Seinfeld should pop out and be like, not that there's anything wrong with that. You know, we talk about the rhetoric that politicians use, whether in election campaigns or while they're in office, but we really tend to underestimate the effect that that has on general public opinion. And you know, as someone who deals with the media on a daily basis, it's that public opinion that I really, you know, have to address and deal with every day. You know, there have been Pew studies that have come out that show that after 9/11, 44% of Americans say that they don't even want Muslims as their next door neighbors. You know, the height of it, and this is a civil rights lawyer in me, and I always like to point this out. Many of you might know this, but you know, a lot of my audiences don't know. You know, 4 days after 9/11, on September 15th, 2001, a 44-year-old man named Frank Roque walked into a Chevron station in Mesa, Arizona, and killed a 51-year-old gas station owner named Balbir Singh Sodhi. And the only reason that he killed him was because he kept a turban and had a beard, as required by his Sikh faith. Mr. Sodhi was so patriotic and so fearful for his life after 9/11, what most people don't know is that he would actually wear red, white, and blue turbans to work, just to let people know that he loved this country and this was his home. And shortly after Mr. Roque had killed Mr. Sodhi, the television cameras came to the Chevron station, and as he was being taken away in handcuffs, Frank Roque just repeated over and over again, "I'm the real American, I'm the true patriot." Now, there, to me, is no better example of the inherent ignorance of xenophobia, especially in the post-9/11 world, than the story of Balbir Singh Sodhi. And everything that we've seen since then has sort of been a byproduct of that. You know, obviously after 9/11 there was a great deal of discrimination and profiling and harassment of Arabs, Muslims, South Asians in the few years after 9/11. And then we, you know, in the few years after, we started to see it plateau. And then we heard about something called the Tea Party movement. And since that time, in the last year or two, it's spiked again. Most people don't know, you know, if you look at like Tea Party convention programs, they have entire plenary sessions on stopping the Islamicization of America, whatever the hell that means. But race, xenophobia, bigotry has now become a permanent political wedge issue in America. And, you know, we've seen this obviously with the Park 51 debate. You know, people... The Park 51 Community Center was first publicized in December 2009 on page A1 of the New York Times. Front page. Nobody said boo. It wasn't until 6 months later when one of the Republican primary candidates for governor in New York, Rick Blasio, decided to make it a political wedge issue, and so he made a TV spot on it. And we've obviously seen the fallout from that, both here domestically and internationally. And notice the midterms are next week, and we haven't heard anything since then because it was meant as a political wedge issue. You have the very, very intelligent Reverend Terry Jones of the Dove World Outreach Center in Florida, who has a congregation of a total of 30 people, who decided that he was going to hold a, you know, International Burn the Quran Day. Well, the media gave that guy so much attention that we had General David Petraeus and President Barack Obama both asking him not to do it. And I wrote a column for CNN, you know, a few days after it happened, basically calling out the media for giving this knucklehead the exposure that he sought. Not because of him, but because of the fact that within 48 hours, we saw 5 copycat Quran burnings at mosques around the country. You know, people talk about the Part 51 debate. What I look at, I always like to highlight the fact that because of that debate, there were anti-mosque protests in Temecula, California, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Sheboygan, Wisconsin, Bridgeport, Connecticut. These people are essentially sending messages, coded messages to people around the country, grassroots communities, that if you complain enough, those Muslims they'll move out of your town. And so, you know, let's not be confused that any of this stuff either A, operates in a vacuum, or B, are one-off incidents. These are concerted political campaigns that have a crap load of money behind them, that are meant to instill fear in the other all around the country, whether it's anti-Latino immigration, you know, with the ridiculous Arizona bill, I mean, there is great racism that still occurs in America today. You know, just because we elected Barack Obama president, we by no means live in a post-racial America. It's just a simple fact. And so, again, when you guys hear of stories like this, I want you to be able to think more holistically and understand that these are not isolated incidents. This doesn't affect just Lower Manhattan in New York or Florida. This affects our entire country. And so, you know, whenever an attack on a person of any color, any faith, any religion, any socioeconomic status is an attack on all Americans. And so, you know, we need to stand up and ensure that there's one standard. You know, when I recently, you know, wrote a column for CNN on this whole Juan Williams thing at NPR. And the headline of my column was, NPR was right in firing Juan Williams. I think there were 4,000 comments on that. It was the third most read story on CNN that day. And the argument is very simple. If Juan Williams had gone on Bill O'Reilly's show and said, you know, every time I see an African American guy with a big afro and a dashiki or a FUBU hoodie, I'm scared. Or if you made disparaging comments about Jews or any other demographic group, it would be rightfully seen as racist, anti-Semitic, whatever. But when it comes to taking a pot shot at Muslims, it's free speech. And the mind-boggling duplicity, and I've been on O'Reilly's show like a dozen times. Why? Don't ask. I mean, the mind-boggling duplicity of Fox News, you know, was brought to bear when not only did they give the dude a job, they had a $2 million check waiting for them. So, for me at least, you know, Islamophobia is a cottage industry in America today. You know, there are people making bank on this. And, you know, we need to call a spade and understand that. And so, you know, we're all in the same boat. You know, when people attack Muslims, they're not attacking Muslims, they're attacking brown people. When they attack Sikhs, they're not attacking Sikhs, they're attacking brown people. And so we have to understand that the civil rights of one American is the civil rights of all Americans. And again, I thank SAALT, you know, for putting together this very, very important report. And I hope, you know, we can keep the conversation moving forward.
Thanks so much, ARSALAN, and you really fleshed out for us, I think, about of how something that happens or one incident that happens is not isolated, that it really does have far-reaching impact. And that's one of the real premises of why we're releasing this report at this time. So right now I want to actually turn it over to all of you to see if you have reflections or questions or comments for any of our speakers or just on the report itself. And I also encourage those of us joining us by webinar to do the same so that we can ask as many questions and get them answered as possible. if you have a question, just raise your hand and someone will come to you with a mic. Yes.
Hi, thank you all for great presentations. One of my questions, I guess, when looking at xenophobia and sort of hate speech is post 9/11 we had political correctness when it came to Muslims, as in stating, but this isn't all Muslims, yet the feelings of hatred and fear sort of kept rising in American society. So my question is, does political correctness in saying, but I don't mean all Muslims, is that actually a way to combat xenophobia, or is there maybe another way we should be looking at it?
Okay, thank you. Just to paraphrase, I think what you're saying is political correctness a way to combat the Islamophobia and xenophobia in this country right now? So I will ask any of you to take it, but I'm going to start at the end with ARSALAN and work my way down.
The concept of political correctness, along with free speech, is sort of one of the right-wingers' talking points. We're a country where political correctness has gone awry. Again, I point to the Juan Williams thing, and it was funny when he was making his statement. He's like, look, Bill, I'm no bigot. And whenever anybody starts with a weak disclaimer that I'm no bigot, you can pretty much bet the farm that they're going to say something bigot. And again, the whole PC free speech debate, again, it's different for different people. Again, I'm all for one standard. If something is anti-black, if something is anti-Semitic, I'm the first one to speak out against it. But I don't want there to be different standards for different groups of people. And so I think that, we've gotten to a point in America today that, if somebody makes, a blatantly anti-black racist statement, I think most Americans, even conservative Republicans, have gotten to the point where they'd be willing to call a spade a spade. But when they want to sort of hide behind things, they're like, oh, well, it's free speech, or, well, we're just, we're a politically correct society. They sort of blame it on the quote-unquote liberal media, which, again, is mind-boggling to me since I work in media. It's one of those things that, they use it as sort of a shield in order to say, well, it allows us not to talk about race and diversity issues freely because, people are politically correct, and so they keep their racist tendencies inside. And it was great what Juan Williams did because, he voiced the fears of a lot of Americans. Well, you know what? If you had said something about, being scared of black people, there are a lot of Americans who might feel that way also, but that doesn't make it right. We don't have to give them a platform on national television, and pay them cash to make those statements. And so, one of the political correctness debate is one of the things that I think is used as a sort of bulletproof vest, by people trying to, perpetuate stereotypes.
And it's a complex issue. The complexity is as we went through that political correct period in our society, it actually made it easier for people not to have to talk about the issue as well. So I kind of look at it maybe slightly differently. That if we could rely on context as well as the content, we'd probably be a lot better off. The context being that we all come to the conversation with a real commitment to have a conversation about race and ethnicity in America. We do an awful job of talking about race and ethnicity in the United States of America. And I'll say there have been times that political correctness has gotten in the way. But in some ways I think there are those who use it as an excuse. If you listen, give me a good example about how people can really try to say the right thing but say it in absolutely the wrong way. Harry Reid got in trouble for talking about why he thought Barack Obama ought to run for president. And if I just describe what he did, I said, well, look, what you had is the majority leader of the U.S. Senate sat down with the only African-American member of the U.S. Senate to convince him to become the first president of the United States. You say, well, that's great. On the other hand, if you listen to the way he did it, he talked, well, he's light-skinned enough not to offend anybody. It raises a number of other issues, but there are times that we have to dig in and try to figure out what people are actually trying to say and work their way through it.
The Negro dialect.
Oh, and absolutely, and he can turn on and off the Negro dialect. I appreciate that. It's both of those things. But the sad reality is that what he was saying, as awkwardly as he said it, I think most people in my community would say was accurate.
Right.
But the way he said it, you know, that all of a sudden the media went after him. Oh, we got to get him now because what he said was racist. So I'm sitting there on somebody's show. I think it was Bill O'Reilly. I like Bill O'Reilly. And he said, well, didn't Harry Reid say something? And if he was a Republican, you guys would have gone after him and blah, blah, blah. I said, no, it doesn't matter what race, what political party he's a member of. We went after Bob Byrd until he apologized and changed his evil ways and all those kind of things and whatnot. But in his case, don't forget what he was saying and what he was doing. The point is that certainly political correctness has been utilized in a problematic way in the past. But what we were trying to achieve, I think, as a nation with political correctness is we need to have these conversations where we have to be respectful. Respectful. You know, there are no dumb questions if it's meant genuinely. You know, until people are asked those questions they think are dumb, and we have an opportunity to actually respond to those questions, again, the context being that we want to have a greater understanding about diversity in America, the further along our society will get, in my opinion.
Thank you so much to both of you. I think we have some questions back there, so Afshan, I'll let you help us out with that.
Hi, thanks again for having this great panel. I'm fascinated by this notion that xenophobia has become a cottage industry, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on, you know, the idea that the Tea Party is a populist movement when I think it really is a well-funded, Fox News supported, corporate-funded xenophobic movement, and how can something like that be combated? The money, the influx of money that is making statements like Barack Obama hates white people or other things legitimate, how can we combat something like that? Thank you.
So I'd like to have, I think Hillary, you were talking to me a little bit about the Tea Party movement before we started the panel, so if you want to start, and Arsalan, if you can follow up.
Sure, I appreciate the cottage industry part of it, but we just really support the NAACP. It shows that in many ways the Tea Party, and I want to go on record saying, I'm not convinced the majority of people that became actively involved with the Tea Party are devout racists. I think there are people that got involved with the Tea Party because they were looking for another avenue to express their political values and political vision for the country. Unfortunately, it comes at a time that we've also seen historically that in which a perfect storm has been created. The perfect storm is